Um, and let me welcome everyone to this portion of the program. I'm Dick Simon. I'll be helping moderate and coordinate this. And so for those who were not on at the end of the last part of the session, Rick Doblin, who often closes, is not going to be participating. So this will go for about an hour and 15 minutes or so. The basic format will be after a brief introduction, we'll be doing sort of a fireside chat type of thing, where our speakers will have an opportunity to share their insights as to what they're doing and additional thoughts. And then we'll open up the Q&A and invite people to do that, please. And probably best is to use the chat function as a way. Let's see how many people, or people can also do a hand raise and we'll see how that will work. So we're joined today by David Elfselman of Brain Futures and Jacqueline Lampert of the Rocking Stone Group. And they're working together on a project that we'll be talking about. First is a little bit of background. So David is Chief Strategy Officer at Brain Futures. And Brain Futures is a national nonprofit dedicated to improving human outcomes by assessing and advancing the practical implications of new scientific understanding of the brain. So very excitedly, they're now working in the area of psychedelics. Launched in 2015, Brain Futures is a citizen advocacy organization that enlists specialists to offer rigorous assessments of and education about brain-based interventions that target specific segments of society. David's co-author of an upcoming paper that's called Expert Informed Guide to Psychedelic Assisted Therapy, being released in October, that he'll be talking about today. Previously, David led the social impact firm Great Gains, which advised on the distribution of nearly $225 million in philanthropy to education, art, and healthcare. And they work with groups including the Gates Foundation, the Dell Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation. David's got a degree in political science and policy studies from UCLA, where he also earned an MBA. He lives in California with his family when he's not in Oregon or going to New York or all the other travel and work that he's involved in doing.
Yeah, less California these days.
Got it. Jacqueline Lampert of the Rocking Stone Group, she's a principal there, and they are a health policy consulting firm based in New York. At Rocking Stone, Jacqueline works with payers, providers, advocacy organizations, and others in the regulatory and legislative aspects of their organizational goals. She's the co-author with Jordana Davis of Brain Futures' May 2022 paper that many of you have seen, Expediting Psychedelic Assisted Therapy Adoption in Clinical Settings, sort of a perfect paper for this group. Previously, Jacqueline served as a Senate Leadership Health Policy Advisor at the Senate Democratic Policy Committee, which represented then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid in negotiations to draft and pass the Affordable the Affordable Care Act. Before joining the DPC, Jacqueline served as legislative assistant to Senator Tim Johnson, and previous private sector experience with the integrated payer providing University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and New York Life Insurance Company. She holds a master's in public policy from Georgetown University and a Bachelor of Science in Communication from Northwestern. She lives in Ohio with her husband and their 2 children. So let me start off with a question. Basic question is, as an overview, what is Brain Futures trying to accomplish with the Psychedelic Assisted Therapy Initiative? David, if you want to start.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Dick. The reality is a couple of years ago, there was this recognition that we needed to have a informed community coalition looking at the medical model. And, I came on board officially as an employee just in July, but have been advising the organization for about 1.5 years. And at that time, it was really a question of how do we start to recognizing that there is 50 years of prohibition of these medicines. There's still a lot of stigma tied to it. However, there is a significant proliferation of both indications that service as well, and a number of compounds within the class that are interesting. And there's lots of questions about what's in the class of psychedelics and not. We'll leave that for another day. But the reality is that was really promising. With Brain Futures itself, it was an opportunity to sort of recognize that there was a number of conversations happening around other segments of this work, but it felt like bringing together advocates from within the medical system that understood this in a really thoughtful way, researchers that would understand how to apply this in a really rigorous way to allow for safety, and then therefore inform citizenry to be able to be prepared to think about this, particularly with the stigma that's been in the past. How do we address that? And it's been really incredible for us. We've always found the strength in working with community and bringing people together, of which several people on this call have participated over the past couple of years. And it's from that and the bubbling up of that we think that we can both come up with a clearer path for what in this case is the medical model of psychedelics, but also hopefully bring together the folks that will be the ones that lead this work. Brain Futures works across all areas of brain health. Our intention is not to be in this space in perpetuity, but we do feel like there's a role for us to organize folks, particularly because this, 2 years ago was a wildly bi-coastal conversation, at least in the public. And now you're seeing a proliferation all throughout areas that you wouldn't otherwise anticipate. And, we certainly don't feel like we are any source of that, but we definitely hope to contribute to accelerate that, because I think all of us contributing is going to be key. And so you can't do citizen advocacy without coalition. We can't do coalition without experts. And that's really the role that Brain Futures is trying to solve for.
Great. Thanks. Can you give any detail about the specific work you're doing to achieve these goals?
Yeah, well, let me just give you a little bit of background that I think will be helpful, because I often get asked, it's funny, we're here at Horizons in the Pacific Northwest, and when I tell people that I live in California, but I work for a Maryland nonprofit, we're a 501c3, and we're a subsidiary of the Mental Health Association of Maryland. There's a lot of confusion about why there's such an emphasis within, MHAMD, our parent organization of Brain Futures, to do this. And if we recall, before 1970, there was a massive proliferation of research throughout the world around these compounds. And one of the core centers of this was the Spring Grove experiment in just outside of Baltimore, particularly focused on LSD. I think it was roughly 63 to 76 that was active. And, it's interesting with this, massive proliferation of conversations and a lot of newcomers in this space. But if you think about it, at that time, there was, Penke, who, of course, is mostly known for the Good Friday experiment, probably among this crowd. But Stan Groff was there, and the living legend that is Bill Richards. And so when this started to become something that was a conversation both in DC and at the state level, it's not coincidental that some of our board members who are psychiatrists, et cetera, that are in their 70s, were in medical school or undergraduate around that time, either in primarily the East Coast. And so I just want to give that background because I think oftentimes that gets lost. Specifically, there's a lot of, like I said, mentioned before, a lot of emphasis on different sectors of this work. I think the largest narrative tends to be around decriminalization, and then I think a little less so ceremonial use, et cetera. And the sort of recognition specifically for Brain Futures is that we have this opportunity to bring people together because we are a virtual organization with folks in different parts of the ecosystem and geographically, just try to think about what is it really needed for us to make medical access possible. And so, anytime you come into a new space, like Holly McCormick, who was my predecessor, did a couple of years ago, you really have to get grounded in what is the fact base. And so they did that, I think, very comprehensively. If you recall, roughly December 2020, Measure 109 had passed here in Oregon. There was a need for what is the research actually telling us? And Brain Futures felt like it was an important time to do a series of sort of foundational papers to kind of do a snapshot in time. The first one, which came out at the beginning of this year, is 175 pages of riveting data around 7 compounds and psychedelics. And what the research is saying about it. What's amazing about it is that has been out for 8 months, and we are already thinking about having to do a revision and or an addendum because it's just been such an exciting time. But specifically, we wanted to highlight what is happening within research, digest it in a way that people could understand it, mostly to inform policymakers and advocates in the space. So if you are in places like New Mexico, which is talking about a referendum right now, or you're sitting at a research university thinking about a new program, you can very quickly get brought up to speed. And so that came out at the beginning of this year. Jacqueline can talk more about Rocking Stone and their history and how they got involved in this work in a second. But our second paper was around clinical access guidelines, because the research is forming and it's great. But secondly, it's important for us to know how we're going to actually apply this in the medical model setting. And I think they did a yeoman's work in both trying to understand the complexity of this and digest it in a way that got very clear. The upcoming paper, just in this community particularly, I want to give a shout out to Mary Casamano at Johns Hopkins. I feel like she's oftentimes overlooked as who I feel like is the heart of the last 15 years of this work. She did a tremendous chapter, about that time, looking at so much of what was taken from a lot of different aspects of this world. We do think that there's a lot to be learned from the medical community, but there's a lot from ceremony. There's a lot from other sectors that we can be learning from. And so our third paper is just an update, really, and an homage to that, because I think it's a time for us to, again, update the information, bring together some more voices. We talked to 22 different experts in the space. Jazz, who's on this call, did an incredible job of understanding all these perspectives and putting them into a narrative that I think is going to be really impactful for the field. And as I suspected, housekeeping was going to ignore my do not disturb. So I apologize for that. And it was really important to, for the third paper, for us to, again, just say, here's that. So those three papers, the first two are out, they're on our website. They're definitely Sunday afternoon reading. And the third one is a little bit shorter. So, I think you'll enjoy those. Excuse me for 1 second. Hello. So that's happened. The reality is that Jacqueline and Jordana's work at Rocking Stone uncovered a specific significant gap in the work of the space. There's a lot of discussion about the infrastructure and what the core infrastructure is going to be for the medical model here in America. But the reality is a lot of discussions were not really informed as much by a broad base of experts. And there really wasn't a clear pathway for us to bring people together and inform the field in a way that can make people understand what clinical access actually could be. And so this past summer, we were funded. We have started 2 work groups. We will start a third one, most likely late this year or early next year. The first focused on professional practice guidelines. There was some aspiration early this year for us to go all the way to standards of care, and if not, get to clinical practice guidelines. The reality is that we're just not there yet. So the professional practice guidelines group is starting to put that together. These are going to be ongoing processes. There'll be multiple months. There's many stakeholders. We think that are core to the space involved. We also have a very strong partnership with the American Psychedelic Practitioners Association, where they have a number of additional work groups that are going to inform us from another number of traditions that are not necessarily our focus, but we definitely want to learn from. And so we feel like taking a comprehensive view and bringing those folks together is going to allow us to have some semblance of what this can look like in the field, by say Q1 of next year. The second one is riveting. It is about insurance reimbursement and how we get there, because at the end of the day, Brain Future is about safe, affordable access to these medicines, and the way that the vast majority of us are going to get to it in the United States, in particularly a safe context, is going to be through the medical model, and we're going to have to get there through insurance reimbursement. So we have a coding and insurance work group looking at the different pathways to get to that. And then the third one, which we frankly just have paused because we're trying to understand the most effective way to bring this group together, is around training standards. There's a lot of players, which we'll talk about later, in the field right now. And it's, with this many different camps and business models already in play, and also some nuance to what we do and do not know about what's effective in the space, it's just going to take some more time for us to design, and feel like that work group is going to be a little more challenging. From there, I think we're going to do more collaboratives. We're going to get much more focused around what are tactically needed in the space. And we will learn that, frankly, from communities like yours. So we will be listening, thinking about what's needed, aggregate smaller groups that can more effectively inform the world. We will stop sending out 80 or 180 page papers. and start working on things that are going to be much more effective in informing the 19 states considering different aspects of some version of this model right now for groups that want to talk about this with their, with their colleagues and peers in the universities, et cetera. And then the last one we'll think about is framing issues for advocates and the public about reframing what the agenda looks like and really kind of prepare people that are much better positioned to advocate or to change public opinion about this than us, over the next couple of years.
Great. Well, David, thank you for that as an overview. Jacqueline, do you want to add and specifically speak to some of what you're directly involved with there?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dick. So as David mentioned, my background is in the policy space, which means I came to this particular field and this work about 18 months ago as a total outsider, which has generally mostly been an asset, but obviously it's been a bit of a challenge. There's been a lot to learn. And my clearest observation over the last year and a half is really how nascent the field is. It really feels like we have a field that's in its adolescence, where we have a good amount of experience and hope for a bright future, but perhaps some overexuberance and sort of at a point where we need to find our place in the world. So for our work, what it's meant is that 2 of the 3 projects we've worked on so far had initial ambitions that were much loftier than were honestly achievable given the state of the field. Those were the paper that David mentioned to try to offer some clinical practice, moving into clinical practice, and then our current work group that we're working on professional practice guidelines. The reality is, in both of those cases, there just wasn't enough evidence or data to draft the documents in a way that's traditionally done in other areas of medicine. And I don't think that is a problem per se, if we can sort of settle into exactly where the field is right now, which we can talk more about later. It's really just the field is young. It's in its adolescence. There's good data, the research exists, but not nearly in the depth and breadth that we see in other areas of medicine. And that's just going to take time. I think too, the part of the challenge is that this work, psychedelic work, is both fundamentally different from other new treatments that may enter the space and fundamentally more similar to other new treatments than some may recognize. So it's fundamentally different, I would say, in at least 3 ways. So first, as David had mentioned, sort of given the history of these compounds and the parallel work in the decriminalization space, this class of drugs comes to the medical world and to the medical model with a lot of baggage. The US obviously has a history of antagonism towards these substances. So their path to clinical trials has not been traditional compared to other new drugs. There aren't many examples of Schedule I substances being tested in trials while simultaneously used for ceremonial or recreational or other purposes. And then we have the ongoing decriminalization efforts, which kind of blur the bright line that Brain Futures believes is necessary between those efforts and the medical model on which the Brain Futures organization is focused. It's also different because it's a drug plus therapy combination. So it's not as easily, it doesn't as easily sort of slide into the canon of treatment options as if it were just another FDA approved drug or device that fits solidly into those buckets that FDA is used to. FDA obviously regulates drugs, but it does not and statutorily cannot regulate the practice of medicine, both as it relates to off-label prescribing of approved drugs, but also to the provision of psychotherapy. So that makes it a little bit different. And then finally, there's sort of the infrastructure question. Given the novel nature of the treatment and sort of the history that it's bringing with it, the field is inclined right now to build its own infrastructure. So this is where we see efforts to create a specialized psychedelic multi-practitioner association, a specialized board to certify the practitioners, potentially or eventually a specialized accreditation entity to accredit those programs. These things already exist in other areas of medicine. So with psychedelics, we're building all this infrastructure to support this new type of combination treatment. And it's a treatment that's simultaneously maybe a little overhyped and certainly misunderstood by most people that aren't intimately involved in the work. So I think the need for an infrastructure that builds trust and legitimacy really cannot be overstated. But we're, building the plane while we're flying it. And even with all of those differences, I think it's important to remember that the field of medicine regularly accepts scientific and treatment advances and folds them into the existing infrastructure. Psychedelics are novel, but they aren't that different from other new treatments that may be introduced to the field. The advocates of those other new treatments typically figure out where they fit in the field and kind of slide into the existing infrastructure and then use it to advance their work. In this case, stakeholders are both building the evidence for the treatment, but also building the infrastructure from scratch. So there's just a lot of work happening all at the same time.
So what is your feel? I mean, you're talking about sort of evidence and data driven versus more anecdotal evidence. You're talking about the need for the new infrastructures, and how much of an issue should people, listening to you right now, how much should people be concerned?
Yeah.
What will this mean for the future of the field?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think ultimately, it's not going to be a problem as long as we can kind of come to what I mentioned earlier, this sort of like shared understanding and shared reality of where the field is. I think there's right now a distance between the reality of the field and how the media, and sometimes, but less frequently, some stakeholders publicly say about this work. So, we've all seen the articles that say psychedelics are going to cure everything, up to and including solving for world peace, which I think everyone that's in the field knows, that's not possible, But I do think that the field needs an honest, shared reality about where we are, what we're capable of today, and what we need more data about and evidence for to build to tomorrow. And really, this kind of transparency is what will break down the skepticism and uncertainty about the potential of these drugs that we're seeing from some corners of the medical system. I think also it's worth noting here that this kind of exuberance or maybe even over exuberance, this happens in medicine all the time. So this crowd might be aware of a new drug that recently came on the scene called Aduhelm, which was hyped as a cure for Alzheimer's, not just a treatment, but a full cure. And the hope for this drug was so overwhelming that even when the clinical trial data proved less positive than it was hoped for, and when the FDA's advisory committee nearly unanimously voted that it didn't demonstrate sufficient evidence for effectiveness, the FDA still approved it using an accelerated approval pathway. So the fallout from this decision, and really the fallout from this overhype, was incredibly widespread. But I think for purposes of the work we're doing here to try to get to clinical practice, the most important fallout was that Medicare, in just a very startling move, refused to cover Aduhelm unless patients are enrolled in randomized controlled trials that are approved by the agency. So, and they made this decision after they had already significantly raised Medicare Part B premiums, largely to cover the cost of Aduhelm, which Biogen priced initially at, I think, $56,000 for a treatment course. So all of this essentially killed Aduhelm as a commercial product. It gave private insurers the cover or the out that they needed to not offer strong or even any coverage for the drug. Biogen subsequently stopped marketing the drug. It withdrew its application for approval in Europe and fired the CEO. So I think this is kind of a cautionary tale to emphasize the importance of being grounded in the reality of where we are as a field and where we can go to ensure that psychedelics don't become the next Aduhelm.
Do you have any concerns that the breakthrough therapy status that several psychedelic drug trials have are too close to the Aduhelm? experience?
I don't think so. Breakthrough is a little bit different than the accelerated approval pathway that Aduhelm was under. Breakthrough allows the manufacturers to have some more assistance from FDA. I'm not necessarily sure that they're getting it, but they're supposed to be able to have some more conversations with FDA and have greater access to FDA officials and systems when they need it to help the bureaucracy move faster. But they're still subject to the same standards that any other drug would be that's not a breakthrough therapy.
Got it. So give us, if you would, the big picture. How do we get from here to broad access to these drugs should they get FDA approval?
Yeah, well, so with FDA approval, I mean, there's still a ways to go. I mean, I would just a little bit of an update that I've had this past week is it does feel like the FDA is very earnest in having communications with the manufacturers about what this looks like, and I think that should be taken as a positive sign about them really being intentional about trying to get this right. So I think that's one thing that's helpful. The reality is that manufacturers will still need to complete the phase 3 trials. MAPS is there right now. We know Compass and USONA are in 2B. There's a number of other manufacturers that are following them within the pipeline. And that's all going to take some time. MAPS, I think, when I saw Rick Doblin speak, 10 or 12 days ago now, his thought was that probably Q4 is when FDA approval looks like is going to happen. And so we're still on Q4 of 2023. So we're still probably 12 to 15 months away. And then from there, there needs to be a new drug application. That has to be review, including potential REMS, which we'll get to in a second. And the DEA is going to have to then look at this in its totality, which fortunately they are already engaged in at a fairly robust level to understand how to reschedule this drug. And as you know, this is a Schedule 1 substance right now. There's multiple schedules. There's talk of it going anywhere from Schedule 2 to Schedule 4 right now. And I think a lot of that is going to come down to determinations by the FDA and the DEA. And frankly, if it goes from a 2 or to a 2 or a 4, there's going to be a lot of other considerations that have to get worked through. So I just want to say, just pause for a second and say we are still likely looking into 2024 before we're talking about this. And so that's great. But you also have to keep in mind that it's not only going to be MDMA to lead in 2024, psilocybin, both in the form that USONA is developed, which is more similar to the generic compound, or COM360 in the case of Compass Pathways. Those are going to follow at probably best late in 24, and then everything else is going to follow after. And so just this is going to be a slow rollout. And I think we just have to be prepared that the exuberance that Jacqueline's talked about it's going to be like staying at that party a little bit too long. There's going to be this period in the middle where you're like, I'm not quite sure. And then it's going to be great at the end. So I just think it's really important for us to spend some time on the REMS. So Jacqueline, if you could take a minute or two to kind of give an overview, because I think that's going to be a huge opportunity and or stumbling block for a lot of this adoption to happen.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And this is where I feel like my background as a policy wonk really comes through. So I apologize if I put you all to sleep. So after the trials are done, as David mentioned, the manufacturer of any drug, not just a psychedelic drug, would submit a new drug application to the FDA. I think to set the stage for talking about risk mitigation, it's important to understand the framework that FDA reviews a new drug in, and it considers 3 basic elements. The first is the target conditions that the drug is treating and the available treatments to provide sort of a context to weigh the risks and benefits. The second is assessing the risk and benefits that are apparent in the trial data. And then FDA determines the need for risk mitigation strategies, which could include things that they'll put on the label. We've seen black box warnings on some drugs. And then a formal risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, which is the acronym REMS, R-E-M-S, that David had mentioned. FDA uses REMS for drugs with serious safety concerns to help ensure that the benefits continue to outweigh the risks of taking the drug. FDA can require a REMS as a condition of approval, which is what we're looking at will likely happen for psychedelics, or it can impose REMS later if it becomes aware of new safety information once the drug's out in clinical practice. So there are 6 different REMS elements that FDA is authorized to use, and they can use just one or they can use several in combination. And I want to walk through them in a little bit of detail because I don't think it's hard to imagine a world in which FDA requires all of these things. The first one is a medication guide, which is for patients, which is sort of inconsequential. We see that with a lot of different drugs. The next is a communication plan for prescribers. So just really a way to communicate with prescribers about risks and benefits and new data that comes in. That seems likely. Packaging and safe disposal technologies, which FDA requires for drugs with a risk of overdose or abuse. That probably makes sense in this case. And then the fourth bucket is called elements to assure safe use, which is a big one for psychedelics, and where I think that most of the negotiation between the manufacturers and FDA will happen. So there are several different elements that FDA can require here. One is special training, experience, or certification for prescribers. Certification of entities that dispense the drug, or limits on the types of entities that can dispense. I don't think any of us think we're going to be able to go to our corner CVS store to be able to pick up this prescription. Evidence and documentation of safe use conditions before dispensing. Patient monitoring, potentially patient registry enrollment. Then if these elements of to assure safe use are required, the manufacturer would have to establish an implementation system and report to FDA on any providers or dispensers that aren't meeting all of those requirements. So it's our understanding that at least MAPS is in conversations with FDA about what REMS might look like, although we don't have knowledge about the specific elements that are under discussion. But as I mentioned, it's not hard to imagine a world in which all of these things are required, in part because when FDA puts together the REMS elements, it is often influenced by the extent to which those elements were already used in the clinical trials. So we've seen a lot of these things happen in the trials. I think, though, because it can get a little nerve-wracking to think about all of these restrictions that FDA could place on access, it's important to also understand the statutory and regulatory guardrails within which the FDA has to operate. So I think one of the most important ones is that FDA cannot regulate the practice of medicine. In the law, this is defined as the authority of a healthcare provider to prescribe a legally marketed device or drug to a patient for any condition or disease within a legitimate healthcare practitioner-patient relationship. So it's a pretty broad exemption. I mean, it basically says that if it's FDA approved and legally marketed, a healthcare provider can prescribe it. FDA representatives have reiterated this position, specifically even as it relates to psychedelics, in a couple different presentations over the past 3 years or so. And they have also stated publicly that the FDA does not regulate the practice of psychotherapy, which is a really key element for this drug plus therapy model that we're looking at. Federal regulations do, though, allow FDA to specify that a drug must be used in conjunction with another primary mode of therapy. And so we've seen examples where this includes diet or surgery or another drug. With regard to psychotherapy, though, other than mentioning psychotherapy on labels for a couple different drugs, or noting that all of the trials for a drug used a combination of the drug with like psychosocial counseling, the FDA doesn't currently require concomitant psychotherapy for any of its approved drugs. With regard to psychedelics, an FDA representative has said in a recent presentation that they have seen the early research that what they call interpersonal support, and I'm using air quotes here because I think it's important to sort of portray their language, that this interpersonal support reduced the risk for psychological adverse reactions but the appropriate extent of the support or monitoring still needs to be determined. So FDA is watching and recognizes the line that they have, and the guardrails that are surrounding them, and I think they're trying to figure out their way too. So I think generally the takeaway is that the FDA will require REMS. The REMS are likely to affect patients, prescribers, and dispensers. But at this point, it's unclear how or whether they would affect therapists or monitors or other non-prescribers that might be participating in the model.
Interesting. I mean, interesting.
David, you're on mute. Sorry, Dick.
Always, Jacqueline's used to me being on mute and talking. It's easy to get caught up in sort of the FDA approval as the ribbon at the end of the marathon. Unfortunately, that's not quite it. There's actually a bit of a folklore tale within this space that's where Rick Doblin's dissertation ends. He's like, what? That's because people don't read all the way to the end. And the reality is there's a lot more to go there. And, Rick has some insights if you want to find his dissertation on maps.org. It's there under his bio. But beyond that, the core elements for us is, it's going to need payers, to cover these drug and therapy combinations. The novelty of it that Jacqueline talks about is really important for us to think about, because even in our conversations with, representatives or staff of the associations or different federal agencies, et cetera, this is new territory for them as well. And so we have to anticipate that this is going to be a little bit more complicated than we'd otherwise see, just because that in alone makes it unique. Also, the stigma of the history of this for the past 50 years is also going to be a consideration. And so, the recognition of the legitimacy of these compounds is really important. And we can all appreciate the fact that it does seemingly have a different compound with a different indication every week having a promising trial. I mean, just one side note I'd like to say there is we really haven't had a systematic review of the evidence to be completed. We're not even sure that it's possible yet. We're in conversations with my alma mater at UCLA about having them potentially look at something like that in 2023. We have to assess right now if we're ready for it. But the reality is we're going to need a lot more information to get there. We're also going to have to figure out what is this pathway to access and affordability. You're going to see in our third paper experts giving us ideas about what this looks like, at the pinnacle, knowing referencing a lot of what we've learned from the indigenous traditions and ceremonial as well as medicine to date. But the reality is that to do this well, it's an expensive model right now. And that expensive model is something we're going to have to really think about. Like if we're going to be willing to pay and what other payers are going to be willing to pay, what both manufacturers are going to expect, and frankly, what therapists and the related ilk are going to think about what's needed for this to actually make sense completely. Because the reality is that's a really expensive model. Societally, we've seen lots of examples where does that investment pay off for us as society? Absolutely. If you look at preschool, there's no clearer example in many ways, but yet we still don't universally fund preschool. And so we're going to have to think about all these things about how we actually make that possible. And so I'd say like our conversations with payers, is leaving us both hopeful and concerned. And there's a lot to work to do. Payers will look for a standard, at which practitioners should be practicing in order to decide what to cover and under what conditions. And, we've had these clinical trials that are very specific, and that could end up being limiting. We're gonna have to have some conversations about that. It's also why with our work group, as much as I think it would be great for us to go straight to standards of care and start to knock this out, I think what we're excited about with establishing professional practice guidelines is it gives us a chance to really incorporate a lot of other people's perspectives and have us come to as a community that includes a lot of different stakeholders, what is it that we need that to then develop fully towards the standards of care. I think it's also going to be important for, APA, the American Psychedelic Practitioner Association, to have its membership in place, of which, many of you I believe are in conversations with, to really have a voice in this space. It's really important for the Board of Psychedelic Medicine and Therapies to come up with a certification exam, that is going to be able to say with confidence, this this person who went through this training program passed this exam, and we believe that they're going to do right, by the people that they're servicing. One side note here in Oregon that we've heard this past week is the state of Oregon has already approved 14 training programs to be up and running on January 2nd or 3rd, 2023. And that's actually before they've developed the exam for which they're going to certify those people. And so there's a bit of, we're in this stage right now where a relatively small group of folks are thinking about this deeply. We're going to need it to be substantially bigger and larger, and frankly have a lot more debate and discussion for us to get to the point where we're really ready to roll this thing out. Our hope with the professional practice guidelines is that we can eventually roll up into clinical practice guidelines, which many of you that are in the field, understand that this is typically how people iterate. That's frankly going to take several years of iteration. And we're hopeful that we can start with the professional practice guidelines, understand some of the gaps in evidence we have, talk to our research colleagues, start to fill those, look at systematic review, inform the field, have practitioners come back through, and that's how we're going to get there. Again, just a couple of years ago, it felt like we were talking about the same half dozen institutions, being Johns Hopkins and NYU and Yale, UCSF on the West Coast, UCLA with Charlie Grove's work, et cetera. And now we're seeing this massive proliferation. I was doing an exercise a couple of days ago thinking about, if we're going to update our paper one, how many researchers are out there right now doing multiple studies, thinking about this from multiple perspectives that have teams under them and institutions supporting them. And so far I'm at 60 across nearly 30 institutions in nearly as many states. And we're talking about places like Baylor and New Mexico, University of Texas, this university right up the street from my hometown at the University of Wisconsin that's, expanded into a bunch of different areas. And it's really exciting to see that we're having all this conversation and real leverage points for us to think about it. Because at the end of the day, if we don't have a lot more research that we can look at, that we can improve our practice guidelines with, that we can be much more clear about what the standard of medicine is, that therefore makes regulators and payers more comfortable, we're not going to get to a system that we'll get to a system that's safe, but it won't likely be accessible or affordable to most people. And the reality is, here in America, we still live within a medical system that is primarily private. The truth of the matter is, nearly 55 to 60% of our of Americans are under private insurance. I'm sure we're all acutely aware of how hard it is just to get a therapist through those processes, let alone something as novel as this. The reality is Medicare and Medicaid are over 30 to 35% of Americans as well. And those folks have a fairly regulated system that is very cautious, as Jacqueline talked about earlier. And so we need to make sure that we are not only meeting the common standard for something like this, we're going to have to go above and beyond because of the history of this. And then, most promising probably for us to show practicum sites or early models or test sites for policy is probably going to end up being in the military. TRICARE is about 3% of Americans. That represents veterans that are active duty. And the VA is about 1% of our population. We're seeing a lot of innovation. I'm excited to go to New York and hear from Rachel Yehuda again on Monday about some of the things that they're doing at the Bronx VA and Mount Sinai. But it's going to be this type of conversation that's going to eventually get us to the field that we eventually want to see, and the level of care and the access that we think is going to be important.
Going from the meta questions, which you're beautifully putting out there, to something like reimbursement codes. Or, for example, the codes that are being submitted by MAPS and Compass sufficient to resolve the complexity that you're discussing. And even the whole concept of a very expensive procedure, not suggesting it isn't worth every cent of it, but someone will look at it as a very expensive procedure and intervention rather than some pills that aren't perfect, aren't even good, but they're pills and they're cheap.
Yeah, absolutely. The fortunate reality is certainly we do have the vast majority of the codes. As different as this field is, and as much as people's imagery of it is that it's dramatically different, the reality is many of the codes that we need to do this work, in its best iteration exists today. The reality is we have codes for patient assessment. We have psychotherapy codes that can be used for both preparation and integration. I think we, on this call in particular, understand that integration is where the public thinks that the medication session is where the wisdom is going to come from, or the healing. We often find that through the integration is where this is really at, and that's well supported by codes that exist today. The medication session is unique. There are definitely within the class of psychedelics many compounds that are short acting, but the reality is the ones that are both leading and that generally people think are the most promising, with MDMA and psilocybin in particular, you're typically talking 6 hours plus or minus a couple. And so that code doesn't exist currently. There's a lot of trials right now and a lot of promise, going back again to the Spring Grove example of LSD. And that's, right now there's lots of people trying to make LSD quicker and faster and more effective, but that's typically a 12-hour experience. Fortunately, we don't, there's a mechanism. We have a curious healthcare system. I'm new to it in the last few years. I've continued to discover new things that are curious to me, but the reality is the American Medical Association holds these CPT codes in place. And if you want just a really comprehensive view of this, the appendix to our paper 2 lays out a lot of these codes. So for those of you that are in practice, we'd love for you to review that. And if you have feedback or ideas for us, we'd like to think about that too, because that's how we'll think about this and improve the model, frankly. But within the American Medical Association, there is a process to get a new code. It happens all the time. In fact, every 13 weeks, the American Medical Association gets together and reviews new codes, revises old codes, et cetera. The reality is they just wrapped up their most recent meeting, this past week, I believe yesterday, and MAPS and Compass have submitted a code. We don't know all the details about it, and there's some things that we do know that we're not allowed to share because of a non-disclosure agreement that we signed. But the things that we can tell you that we learned outside of that is that it is a 6-hour code with add-ons. The reality is we have an also unique pathway with these clinical trials right now, where there are 2 therapists in most of these trials, and the expectation is that we're going to have to continue that, at least initially, with the FDA, and that's a little bit outside of the norm. We're also looking at if there's a need for additional time beyond 6 hours, how do we approach that? So we're going to learn pretty quickly here when information comes out about what the AMA decided, and we might be good to go and have what we think is a skeletal framework for a complete coding structure for this space. We'll learn. We'll learn. The reality is that we've convened a work group to look at this, and we hope that in the next few months we can put out a paper well in front of FDA approval that can inform all of you about what's possible within this, and hopefully have a robust discussion, so that when we get into this actually being moved into practice, there's already a strong understanding within the practitioner community about how they're going to approach this work, whether it's in addition to their current, clinical or offerings within, their professional model, or if this is something that's new. But I do think there's some cautions for us to be aware of, and I'd like Jacqueline a little bit to, touch on coding as it relates to esketamine. Obviously a derivative of ketamine, and I think there's a lot for us to take away from that example.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I saw Karen had put in the chat whether Spravato would offer any lessons. And then I'm going to get back to Dick, your question about sort of the sufficiency of the code that MAPS and Compass have applied for. But first, thinking about Spravato or esketamine, it's really important to consider this sort of payment model, not because it's the best model that we think psychedelics should follow, but because it's really the only psychedelic that payers currently provide coverage for. And in our conversations with payers, we learned that they're kind of defaulting in their headspace to esketamine as a comparator because it's the only experience that they have. So Spravato was approved by the FDA in 2019 for treatment-resistant depression, and then it was expanded. The indication was expanded to include major depressive disorder in 2020. So the same year, 2020, Medicare issued a new HCPCS code for esketamine. The problem is that the codes that are required when billing Medicare for Spravato combine the drug, the price of the drug, with the required 2-hour observation or monitoring period that FDA requires after the drug is administered. Commercial payers, on the other hand, they want to keep those things separate. They want to pay for the drug under the pharmacy benefit and the monitoring under the professional services benefit. And it's created a lot of confusion among providers and payers. And we know that in general, in the healthcare space and probably in the world, confusion doesn't lead to efficiency. In healthcare, it doesn't lead to broad access. And it's become sort of a mess for Spravato. So I think that's a lesson that we really need to have a coding strategy and a reimbursement strategy that recognizes the medical model in which we are operating, dysfunctional though it may be, so that we can try to get as broad access and as broad payer coverage as possible so that as many people can access this as they can. Before I move on, I did want to comment a little bit, Dick, on your question about sort of the sufficiency of this code. You know, David had mentioned we have a work group right now on coding and reimbursement. And so I really don't want to get ahead of them. We haven't had a chance to discuss a code for this dosing session in depth with them. But, you know, David kind of gave the general overview of what we know about the code. The panel considered the code, the CPT editorial panel of the AMA considered the code application on Friday. They haven't posted the results of the vote. And I watched the panel's consideration, which is confidential, but I think in general, I can share sort of a few observations. I would say that the panel expressed in their questions a need for more specificity within the code description, particularly with regard to whether a physician or a qualified health professional is providing psychotherapy during the entire 6 hours that the base code would cover. So they applied for a 6-hour code for psychedelic psychotherapy services. And they wanted to know, is it, 6 hours of psychotherapy the whole time, or is there some monitoring, some breaks, that sort of thing? And then they also expressed some concern that the application may not meet the criteria for a new code. The CPT editorial panel has very strict requirements for making a new code. In reality, there is no code that covers a 6-hour treatment. But I do think there's probably some work to do to help the panel understand why this needs its own code. The panels, they didn't post any of their votes or any actions they took online yet. They will, but they haven't posted them. And as it relates back to our work group, we're prioritizing a complete coding and reimbursement strategy. We really want to focus on accurately describing the services provided, simplifying coding and reimbursement, and maximizing access to care. And part of that the work group's been very focused on is making sure that we have flexibility for evolution in the model of care, which is something David had mentioned. The work group is keenly aware that the real world clinical practice may not look exactly like the clinical trials. In particular, we know that there's trials that are happening with group dosing so that we could utilize practitioners with a number of patients at the same time so that we don't have that 2-to-1 ratio. There needs to be some room for the science in the field to evolve while we still have that payer coverage that ensures we have access to this care.
Thank you. I have several more questions, but I want to open also to those who are listening who have questions. Alice, would you like to state your question, or would you like me to read it? I'll take silence to mean read it. So how are other intensive psychotherapy protocols coded, like inpatient addiction treatments? And what are the potential lessons or similarities and differences?
Yeah, I can kind of give some observations and David can add. We haven't looked as much at inpatient addiction treatments simply because it's our understanding that the provision of care for psychedelic assisted therapy is more likely to happen on an outpatient basis, so at a clinical practice or physician office, as opposed to something that would require inpatient admission to a hospital. So some of the things that we have started exploring are intensive outpatient treatment, which has a very specific requirements as far as the number of hours of therapy goes every day. So we've started to look at those kinds of things as well. That wasn't where MAPS and Compass went in their application to the CPT editorial panel. They really went with a completely new code, as opposed to seeing if we could use some of those intensive outpatient codes. I think it's possible. At the same time, I think it's, you want to be sure. The second half of the process here is not just getting the code, but then establishing the value of the code, which is what leads to reimbursement, either from Medicare or any kind of payer. So you also need to look at the code you're choosing and what it's valued at, so that we can ensure these providers, practitioners, therapists, people that are offering these services are appropriately reimbursed for the time and effort that it takes to be with a patient through that entire dosing session. So there are a number of moving parts. I realize I didn't answer that question totally specifically, but that's where my head's at right now.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I think part of the recognition is, and this is where I'd like to talk a little bit about, next steps for everybody, is we've been very narrowly focused on a continuation of where the clinical trials are. And so we're not talking about inpatient. We haven't even begun to explore what group modalities could look like, which is obviously a potentially massive opportunity for us to drive affordability. And so, we're a relatively small group. And so I think we want to just be thorough in what our mandate is, and just recognize the fact that there's a lot of questions, and we would invite more collaborators, in helping us to think that through, because the truth of the matter is, we are in a fairly narrow path right now.
Okay, thank you. And Anand had a question about could psychedelics adopt the time-based coding units like anesthesia interventions?
I can start with this one as well. We haven't looked at the anesthesia codes, but what we have looked at is just the time-based E&M codes or the time-based psychotherapy codes. What we have found, a couple of hurdles when we have had our conversations with payers. One is that if you bill too many of those time-based codes on one day, it'll automatically trigger a rejection for the claim because the insurers are not set up to have a 6-hour outpatient or physician procedure in a day for those types of codes. The second is that as soon as you have the same provider or two providers billing, even if they're different types of providers, if you have two billing for the same services for the same patient on the same day, that will also trigger a rejection. So in order to use those codes, you would have to negotiate edit overrides with each individual payer in advance. We feel that that's not the most efficient way to go about this, that we need to have a sort of a plug and play system. That may be where we end up, at least initially, although it seems like we've got some time before, as David had mentioned, Q4 23, looking at 2024 and into clinical practice. But it's really trying to match up these really clunky coding systems and clunky payer systems and trying to find a way to make this fit into both of them in a way that's easy for everybody.
And it's a massive task, and it sounds like you're really approaching it well, and how important it is. Could you tell a little bit more about the third work group on the training program accreditation? Can you share some more?
Yeah, I mean, as like I mentioned earlier, we're really early on that one, but I think it's important for us to, I just want to recognize where we're at today. Drug manufacturers have their training programs in place right now, so that includes MAPS and USONA and Compass. They have, there's some discussion and possibility that will become a requirement, to do their training program to administer those compounds. That feels like that could be challenging in terms of us getting to adoption, but that's one consideration for the work group that we have to think about. You also have, institutions like CIIS that have had a certificate program for about 7 years and have done a really great job of bringing licensed folks into this field, and want to honor that. And we really have to learn more before we're able to, leverage a program like that, as well as recognize, Naropa's new program. And then, we're starting to see major research universities as well launching their own programs, and they're in development. And two, I just want to note, because I think the field should be aware of, is actually all three. Between Columbia, Heidi Allen is working on for social workers at Columbia and the School of Social Work, as well as through Penn Nursing, a program for practitioners to get trained through those programs. You just might have seen the announcement this past week, supported by Hefter, for Yale, Johns Hopkins, and NYU to come up with a postdoctoral program. That's really interesting for a number of reasons. And then, the PharmD program at the University of Wisconsin is really interesting too. And so we're starting to see these programs, take place as well. And then finally, as I mentioned at the top of this call, there's 14 programs approved by the Oregon Health Authority that are loosely based on the regulations that were passed through Measure 109. And although that's not the medical model, we have to be informed, because there is, I think, some confusion among the public, at least here in this state right now, because the Measure 109 was largely pitched as a therapeutic intervention, which has now been sort of backtracked off of. Measure 110 was a decriminalization measure here in Oregon. And I think we just have to be aware that those exist, and we have to think about them really thoughtfully to make sure that we're honoring kind of the contributions that they can all give, because many of these upstart ones are very much leaning on the schools around the world, largely tied to indigenous communities, that I think have a lot for us to learn from too. So the answer, Dick, is, we're going to take this one really slowly. And if you have ideas, or if anyone on this call has ideas about how we should think about this, or would like to contribute in some way, we feel like this one's going to be particularly challenging to sort of work from the bottom up. Part of the reason why that is so challenging is that because groups like BPMT, the Board of Psychedelic Medicine and Therapies, haven't developed their exam yet. That's still in process. Therefore, we really don't know what the content is, that at least from that side of it, that we feel that they feel is important for us to do. And so we're kind of building this, not really knowing where we're coming from or where we're going to. And so therefore, it's a little bit more of a challenging process.
So on challenges, how concerned are you, or how concerned should others be about potential blowback to non-medical use, to Oregon, et cetera, from mainstream American Psychiatric Association being sort of an example right now? But is that the tip of the iceberg, or any thoughts or reactions to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's a real, just being here in Oregon these past few days, where I think most people that are either involved in it or, excited about the possibility are having a little bit of a reality check about what this rollout is going to look like. At the same time, I don't know what blowback really looks like. I think at the end of the day, we're going to have adverse events no matter what. I think how we handle them and learn from them, and the thoughtfulness that has been taken in place to prevent them, is going to be really key. But at this point, I'm not sure that it's clear whether or not there's going to be a decidedly important amount of blowback from any particular sector. It doesn't seem like that's formulating. There's a lot of curiosity, and I think that that's actually promising.
Great. I have additional questions, but I want to invite, if anyone has questions that they want to be asking, feel free. So we recently heard about a federal task force that's being developed for psychedelic use. What do you know about where in the process it's at? And what do you think the federal government should be focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the reality is we still don't know a lot because I think they're really deep in discussion themselves. We know that there has been conversations about a request for information, which in my mind is just an indication that the federal government is really interested in learning more, which I think is an incredible development. A number of agencies are involved in that discussion. My understanding is that this is largely derived by Secretary Becerra's work within the HHS, and involves institutions that include SAMHSA and NIDA, the DEA, the FDA, et cetera. So the continuation in the Department of Justice with the DEA is really interesting. It sounds like, there's been various articles that have come out. The one in Politico last week, I think was interesting. Was initially kind of a emphasis around veteran access and veteran, we know, it's often cited that 22 veterans a day kill themselves, as a result of what they experienced in their service. We talk a lot about moral injury with that space. We thought that was initially going to be the focus. We've heard other emphases that I think are really important, like ceremonial use and what does that look like? That ends up being more of a religious discussion. I think how do we deal with the fact that the drug war we recognize doesn't work? I think that's what I understand has been part of the discussion. For us, we're really specifically focused on the sort of medical lane. And I would hope that, although those discussions are all critical, those feel like they need to happen in their own container. So whether it's HHS or, whoever is dealing with the ceremonial side of this, I think it's really key for them to be, a little bit more structured around solving for what that modality needs, as opposed to it being a broader umbrella. But if I were to just step back from all of it, that discussion is really important. But I actually feel like the biggest vacuum that the federal government can step into right now is publicly funding research. We heard from Stephen Ross this week here, who's at NYU and has done a lot of work on alcohol use disorder, that they're trying to do a study that is going to include a couple of hundred participants. It's going to cost $25 million. And that's one study. And so if we extrapolate how much we would need to satisfy groups like the American Psychiatric or American Psychological or American Medical Association to really change behavior among policymakers, et cetera, you have to assume that we're talking in the several hundred millions of dollars. And other than a referendum from a Western state specifically targeting something like that, the federal government is probably the only institution prepared, other than the EMA out in Europe, that could put that type of muscle behind this. And I feel like if the federal government were to really want to try to understand this, that's where I would emphasize the focus these next few years.
Great. There was not a referendum, but Texas, actually, the legislature approved funding. So it doesn't have to come from a coastal state or West.
There's a coast in Texas.
Right? Oh, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. I stand totally corrected.
Yeah, but that's a fair point, Dick. And I think actually really important too. I mean, I do think that I live a little bit in my bias. The West Coast has done a lot, but the reality is I'm really excited to see the work that's done on the East Coast. And what's great about living in the West and working for an organization in the East is I see all that. But honestly, the bill, that you're talking about in Texas, the conversations that we're seeing in states like, potentially in Michigan and New Mexico and others, Florida could potentially be in play this year. That's really exciting. And we could clearly have tranches of funding for specific populations or indications, et cetera, that could happen. And we should definitely encourage that in all of our local jurisdictions. But the question was about the feds, and I feel like the only other juggernaut that can make it happen, it would be my home state of California. So,
what about commercial? Companies.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, AUD is a major potential. B-More is pursuing it. Others are looking at it. What about the likelihood of that funding coming from commercial sources?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'm a little bit, I just with the change in the markets lately and sort of the sentiment that I'm hearing among investors, that stuff is expensive. And so I absolutely think that commercial could end up driving a big chunk of that. And so thank you for, pointing out that omission. It's just, having talked to a number of investors across both in primarily European and North American investors these past several months, I've seen this caution that's emerged, and I think that there's a couple of companies right now that are struggling to raise their next tranche of funding to continue their research, and obviously BMOR is doing fantastic work. Hopefully there can be again that. So I appreciate you reframing that, because I think major funding from the government source is great, but obviously commercial has a lot to do here as well.
And what would you see? What studies would you like to see, or what would you most highly prioritize?
Oh, I mean, bar none, I think the greatest challenge we have, and if you haven't seen what Cody Wenther is trying to do with the Poesis study at the University of Wisconsin, I think we have to have an honest conversation about the fact that the vast majority of study participants, and if you people know my history, I started as at a trial at Yale. That was the beginning of my psychedelic journey. Unfortunately, participants in these trials look like me, and we're going to have to really talk about how do we either diversify these trials, or what are other modalities where we can get information about this. And I'm also on the board of the Fireside Project, which many of you know as a peer support line for people that are actively or integrating their experiences. But we're having a real honest discussion because we are so have so much emphasis on BIPOC and queer communities. Like, how do we get them involved in this conversation? And I think that that's where I feel like if we're going to heal this country and then expand into other places around the world, we've got to have these look like us. But I'd love to hear from Jacqueline, because she's thought about this quite a bit too.
Well, I was just going to add, David, I think that's a great point, that's not only important from a research perspective, but also moving forward, it's important from a coverage perspective. Medicare, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have a huge initiative now on health inequities, reducing health disparities. Payers are starting to pay a lot of attention and creating different types of benefit programs to really target those types of disparities and eliminate or reduce as much as possible health inequities. So it's not, it's not just to sort of advance the science, but it's also to try to get this out to as many different populations as we possibly can. I think I absolutely agree. That's the top priority. I think for me, as we're looking at the professional practice guidelines and the evidence base that's available to draw from there, a lot, we have the trials and various trials, right? We're not just looking at the stage 3 trials, we're looking at any number of trials, but they all really look a lot alike in terms of the model of care. And so, and I realize that that's in part because of restrictions that have been placed by the FDA and building on past research and evidence, which I completely understand. But in order for us to really understand what works, we need sort of head-to-head trials that compare this type of treatment therapy modality with this type of therapy modality. I'm trying to think of another example, but we need to start experimenting a little bit, because right now what we have is sort of like drug therapy outcome, and we need nuances in the therapy and nuances in the model of care to really understand what are the important parts of this and what parts of it are not as connected to the outcomes, so that we can start really having a conversation about what professional practice looks like.
Yeah, and that's what I feel like government really has to step in again, because whereas large amounts of these research dollars are coming from commercial, you see, Filament's relationship with UCSF, or MAP's involvement in many institutions, USONA, Gilgamesh, et cetera. You see all these trials happening, and that's great. But because this is still a competitive market and they have to be efficient with their funding, they're very narrow in focus. And then when you talk to the regulators or you talk to the associations, particularly the APAs, they want to see, a lot of coordination, but including in methodology, and they want to see RCTs that have populations that, frankly, an individual manufacturer, particularly a startup, would not be able to do. And so that's where it's going to be important for us to just find a way for there to be a little bit more coordination, obviously a lot more diversity, and understanding more of what the endpoint is for us globally, as opposed to whoever might be the sponsor for that particular trial.
So mentioning RCTs, how concerned are you, or how much are you seeing around concerns about the incredible difficulty of blinding a psychedelic.
Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion.
Go
I
ahead.
feel like we don't. I feel like we haven't started to have the conversation yet about what we're going to do about it. It's been great here because you've got a lot of, Robin Carr Harris was up here this week, Brian Anderson, Lynette Alvarell, and others are, just incredible researchers. I think we have to have a discussion about this and have a real answer. I don't think we can, pull one that's there. But this is unique. I mean, everyone that's had an experience is probably very well aware that a placebo is pretty obvious in this context.
And have you heard things in conversations around concerns about that invalidating data?
I think it's in anticipation of what the associations will say. The reality is there's just so much. I think they're just going to want to, they're going to want to follow their process, and their process has been tried and true, over and over and over again for compounds that don't have this challenge. So I just think it's too early to have a conclusion about it. I think we should be in the question stage and figure out a solution for it, over the next several months, because obviously we want funding to follow that wisdom.
Great, thank you. So you're currently in Portland. It sounds like you're leaving later today to go to New York. Are there a few highlights of the Horizons Northwest Conference that you want to share with the group?
Yeah, I actually think it's an incredible bellwether for the field. The reality is we're 3.5 short months away from this being a market for psilocybin services in the state of Oregon. And I think there's two major takeaways. One, I think the exuberance bubble here has been overtaken by this is going to be hard. This is going to be challenging. There's a lot of nuance to this work. And where I think a relatively small number of people thought this was going to be a clear lane to something being available, I don't think it's necessarily played out from that. And I think the other aspect that comes out of this is we have to be clear about our communication. Measure 109 did have a therapeutic emphasis during the campaign. It's caused a lot of confusion in the public about how now they say this is not a therapeutic intervention. That is a challenge in and of itself. But I also think we have to get much clearer in our messages between the different communities that want to support this. The reality is there's not a lot of emphasis here within the medical community, and frankly, the absence of them, at this conference has really been a curious development. And I think we have to separate, where the medical model needs to go, where decriminalization needs to go, where ceremonial use needs to be honored and recognized and developed. And we have to, even though we might share this commonality that is these compounds, though the way to implementation is very unique for each. The communities are very unique, though actually the efficacy of them still has to get built out at scale in a way that we've never seen, in the world. And there'll be a lot of lessons between each of them, but I think we have to get clearer about our narrative, and we have to engage in very clear conversations within each of those buckets.
So just to make sure I'm clear, and others listening, so there was very low participation or absence of, I think it's your term, those involved in medical use.
Yeah, there's definitely doctors here, but I've been really tactically focused on licensed folks here and trying to interview them and understand where they're coming from. And many of them see much more possibility in them leaving their licensed hat, because there's a lot of talk here in Oregon about you have to, via the rules and regulations here that the Oregon Health Authority is proposing, if you're a licensed therapist and you step into a psilocybin services center to become a facilitator, you're licensed both as a, let's say, a psychoanalyst here as well as a facilitator. The expectation is you go see a client in the morning for 50 minutes in psychotherapy. At lunch, you move over to a psilocybin service center. You have to essentially turn off your knowledge as a therapist when you're in that service center delivering that. And I think the reality is, there's a lot to work through that. And when you talk to the practitioners there, they're having some dissonance in their own head about how that's possible. And I think it's just one of those things that we have to work through, between the respective, folks.
Yeah, it sounds like rather than how that's possible, it's just acknowledging the brain doesn't work that way. But yeah.
Well, the rules are going to say that we must, so
I-
I don't know how we work.
I wasn't suggesting the rules wouldn't. That was great. So are there what you've been wonderful sharing with the group. What is, how can people on this call support the work you're doing? Support, be engaged, however it might work.
Yeah, look, I was really fortunate in my undergraduate days to have a professor that many of you are aware of, in Governor Dukakis. And, he would talk about anything you wanted to get done, you had to get done door to door. If you wanted to win the presidency, which, we know he came close on, you want to win a governorship, you want to get legislation passed, you've got to think about your blocks, you've got to think about individuals. And I think the number one thing that we can all do is just be clear about your advocacy for this work, and organize, find groups that you work with, talk to groups, make sure that you're constantly expanding that group, because I think the reality is you'll be surprised. I had a situation on a plane a few weeks ago where I was going through the paper that Jacqueline co-authored, and the gentleman next to me was curious, and he's a Christian pastor in Alabama with 9,000 people in his congregation, and he started telling me his LSD stories from the 70s and his exuberance for Michael Pollan and how he really feels like he ended up finding his spirituality through it. But he doesn't know how to engage. And I feel like whatever those communications are within the communities that you are, I think that's really important. The other one is we are a very narrowly focused field right now. The reality is this Horizons conference is less than 1,000 people. New York next month will be, somewhere in the 2,000 to 3,000. That's still a very tiny slice of this world. We're going to need a massive amount of innovation in this work for us to be able to make it accessible, affordable, and safe. We aren't addressing things like inpatient. We aren't addressing the fact that a lot of people have indications, and the general wisdom among the trials is that we just screen all those people out and we focus on near healthy normals with maybe one indication, some aspect like that. There's a lot of reality for us to do a lot of innovation and treating real serious issues. And then things like group, we don't really do much around this. So if you have the ability or you're part of a community, particularly tied to a research institution or a practice group, think about what this can look like. Have conversations, start speaker series, bring people in. Let's normalize what a lot of us are keeping, fairly quiet now, and start to make that, start to make those communications happen. Public opinion is moving in favor of this. It is going to continue to, but we all have to do our own work and contributing that to happen. And I invite you to do that in the way that you feel is most appropriate for you, but I just ask that you do it. And then I guess just the last thing I'd say is for Brain Futures, selfishly, we wouldn't be here providing this information to you without the contribution of many, many, many people. And the only way that we're going to get better, wiser, faster is if we actually have more inputs and more outputs and more circles of conversation. And so if you've heard something today that you feel like doesn't sit quite right with you, or you want to learn more, if you feel like you want to contribute to something we're thinking about, if there's something we haven't talked about and you feel like it needs something that we need to anticipate and the field needs in the next 1 to 5 years, we'd love to hear it. We'd love to engage. We have a fundraising apparatus as well. If there's a way for us to expand our scope, for us to allow for those conversations to happen, we'd love to engage with you, because Jacqueline's brilliant. I pretend to be, but the reality is we're a small team, and we only can do this by facilitating conversations, advocating for folks, educating folks. And so if you know people at institutions, if you know politicians, if you know policymakers, if you have higher up friends at the association, whether they're currently or they've since retired, and we're open to have this conversation, we'd love to have those folks begin incorporating into what we hope is not our conversation, it's our conversation. I think that's the way that we're gonna have this become something that is, a vestige of what we feel like this could be for not just our communities, not just the people these compounds can serve, But I don't believe strongly yet that this is going to solve world peace or save society, et cetera. But we can clearly be a much healthier society if we start to go down this path, and each of us have a role in that.
Great. Thank you. And Jacqueline, being now certified as brilliant, do you have any comments that you would like to make, other than to kick David for making it that hard for you?
Right. Just giving me further to fall. No, I really, there were some really interesting questions that I'm already thinking about that came up during this group. I would love to hear more. I had sent Anat a message. I'm not sure if she's still on, about the wanting to better understand the anesthetic interventions. These conversations always give us more ideas, new research pathways, new things that we should be looking at. But please do reach out. I think there's the only way, like David said, that we can really create great products that help serve this field is by getting all the perspectives that we possibly can. So we welcome your good brains to join in this work.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to share, for those who didn't see it in the chat, because it summarizes everything from Paul Corey. The info today is very valuable. Great need to share it. So thank you both so much for the valuable information sharing with us today, and more importantly, the incredible work that you're doing out in the world. So let's all unmute for a moment, or at least I've unmuted. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. This was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, and Jazz shared my email in the chat, so please let's continue this conversation. And Dick, thank you for the invitation, because the reality is, this is the community that I think is just so important to me, as many as you know, and I was just so proud to have this opportunity to share this with you all, because I have frankly learned most everything that I know from all of you. So just with a tremendous amount of gratitude, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to let people know two things. One, a recording of this will be available, so that, for those who couldn't join, for those who want to hear it again, sharing, whatever. And then secondly, on Sunday, November 6th, as Ann mentioned to those who were on earlier, Graham Boyd, who has been, some call it, is certainly one of the key architects in this entire space in terms of decriminalization. He was a lead in creating Oregon 109. He'll be sharing with us his perspective on what is going on in Oregon, as well as more broadly. So thank you all so much for joining, and have great days. Take care.
Hi, everyone.
Bye.